this is Alice Walker. I've got Alice Walker's website pulled up, but I wanted to start with some information from the book. This is on page 912, 913 in the book. Just at the beginning of the introduction, if the two daughters at odds over family heirlooms in the story Everyday Use, Alice Walker resembles each one. Like the burned Maggie, she spent a childhood even more limited than her family's rural poverty dictated. For as a little girl, she was shot in the eye with a BB gun, and the disfigurement plagued her until it was corrected during her college years. Like Dee, she was able to attend college, first Spelman and then Sarah Lawrence College on a scholarship, and she acquired urban sophistication from the North. Many of Walker's characters become adept in the new cultural language of the Black Arts and Black Power movements to which the author contributed as a young writer. Like the mother, though, Walker is given to seeing both sides of a situation, the Dee side and the Maggie side in the case of this story. And when it comes to choosing between her characters' opposing positions, she tends to be critical of her own personality first and extremely sparing in her judgment of others. That's an important point in understanding this story, because I would suggest that in the story Everyday Use, there is no wrong sister. One of the sisters ends up with the quilt, and there seems to be this conflict over heritage and legacy and what to do with the artifacts of your heritage. There is no clear right or wrong answer in this story in terms of how to feel or how to deal with or how to respond to your heritage. Whether you want to preserve it almost like it's a museum piece like Dee wants to, or whether you want to take an active role in participating in it like Maggie does in terms of learning how to quilt, carrying on the family traditions, things like that. As they mention in this introduction too on page 912, Alice Walker, like Toni Morrison, belongs to the Black Arts movement. We talked about that when we talked about Toni Morrison. She, like Toni Morrison, is of that second wave of the Black Arts movement. In the 1960s, she was a part of the Civil Rights movement and actually marched with Dr. Martin Luther King. But after that, she very clearly became a part of the Black Arts movement, and especially the sort of Pan-African Black Power, the kinds of behavior that you see in the story that Dee is using. Often when I think about this, I think about the rise in popularity of the Afro and especially the dashiki. You can see that here. It became really popular in the 1970s in that Black Arts movement, Black Power, Black Rights movement. And you can see even here in the United States, they have a section on Wikipedia connecting it to the Civil Rights movement and the Black Power movement, and the wearing of dashikis and the kind of colorful clothes that Dee and her boyfriend have on when they come home to visit Maggie and the mom. You can see that kind of colorful clothing right there. And if you just Google it, you can see all these kinds of colorful imagery that people have, both male and female. This story was published in 1973, and you can it very much feels of that post-civil rights Black Arts movement time period. You can see here, and the Walker response topic deals with that opposition. Explain how Dee and Maggie counterpoint one another in everyday use. The ways that they are set up to oppose each other. This is what I was talking about when I was talking about how they respond to their heritage, how they, their argument over the quilts, their argument over the butter churn, their argument over the way that the mom and Dee argue about her name and the sort of history versus memory that happens. We'll talk about that in just a second. How are they set up to oppose one another, and in what ways is that opposition acted out? We'll try to work through that as we go through the story. What is the mother's role in this opposition? As they tell you in the introduction, the suggestion is that she's in that sort of middle space between them. How does she deal with the counterpointed sisters and the problems created by their opposition, the sort of tension between them? The other thing that is worth mentioning, very clearly worth mentioning, when you talk about this story is traditionally read in American literature as one of the great examples of Epiphany. and as a way to understand the concept of epiphany, an event in which the essential nature of something, a person, a situation, I would argue in the case of this story, it's a situation, and what the mom realizes is the truth about the situation between the sisters, and how Dee has never learned to be told no. She has a hard time with people telling her no, and how Maggie has always sort of deferred and is not used to people saying yes and taking her side and giving her things, which is what happens at the end of this story. A person, a situation, or an object is suddenly revealed or perceived. It serves as an intuitive grasping of reality that is achieved in a sudden flash of recognition, in which something is seen in a new light. It is thus a sudden insight that comes usually to some character. In this case, the narrator, the mom character. It's useful to understand. One of the reasons this story is often read as such a good example of epiphany, and it's read as such a useful example of that, is epiphany up until the early 20th century was only a religious experience. It referred to suddenly seeing the truth of God, or suddenly having the truth of God suddenly revealing some deep universal truth to you, which is the way that it is described when the mother has an epiphany in this story. It's really only in the past 120 years or so that we've thought of epiphany as extending beyond like religious insight, or like, you know, a shaft of light shining down and angels singing the truth to you or something like that. It's also worth mentioning that Alice Walker is from Georgia. Let's see if we can find her. Here we go. You see her there. She was born in Eatonton, which is between Atlanta and Augusta, in the 1940s, right near the end of the World War II. And as they mention in the introduction in the book, she was shot by one of her cousins in the eye with a BB gun when she was 8 years old. And she did not have that damage to her eye, the scar tissue in her eye repaired, really until she was in her late teens at college age. They started repairing it when she was 14, as they tell you right here in Wikipedia. One of her most famous pieces of writing is an essay about the scar tissue in her eye and how it made her feel when she was younger, called Beauty When the Other Dancer is the Self. Alice Walker's most famous book, by far and away, is The Color Purple. Famous book, famous movie. The books that she is famous for are these books of the 70s and 80s. The Third Life of Grange Copeland, which is her first novel, and then Meridian, and then The Color Purple, like I said, by far and away what she's most famous for in 1982, and then The Temple of My Familiar in 1989. That period from 1970 to 1990 is really what she's famous for, although she has stayed busy and kept working. You can see she's still publishing work right here. This story is from a collection of hers called In Love and Trouble from 1973. Let's get into the story. You can see this is a first-person narrative story. This is a story told by the mother, and she walks you. I will wait for her in the yard that Maggie and I made so clean and wavy yesterday afternoon. It is also worth talking about that there is a lot of Southern folk culture in this story. And part of the division in this story is the way that the mother and Maggie treat that culture versus the way Dee feels about it. The bare yard that you rake clean is this traditional African American Southern custom or culture that you would have this bare yard. You would make designs in it with a rake or a broom or something like that. That I made so clean and wavy yesterday afternoon. A yard like this is more comfortable than most people know. It's not just a yard, it's an extended living room. When the hard clay is swept clean as a floor and the fine sand around the edges lined with tiny irregular grooves, there's the sweeping with one of those old sagebrush type brooms. Anyone can come over and sit and look up into the elm tree and wait for the breezes that never come inside the house. The first section of this story, what's on 613 and then up to the top of 614, is this long sort of, the mother imagines her being a different person, being the kind of person that Dee would really like her to be, this sort of cultured, urbane, educated person who could go, if you don't know Johnny Carson, he was a famous talk show host, really the most famous talk show host in the 1970s, 1980s, into the 1990s. She imagines going on this talk show with Dee and her, being what Dee wants her to be. In real life, though, I'm a large, big bone woman with rough, man-working hands. In the winter, I wear flannel nightgowns to bed and overalls during the day. I can kill and clean a hog as mercilessly as a man. My fat keeps me hot in zero weather. I can work outside all day. In reality, what the mom is telling you is she's not the kind of mother that Dee would like to have, that Dee imagines, but she is the kind of person who fits in this rural central Georgia environment where Dee and Maggie both came from. And then you get introduced to Maggie right here with the "How do I look, Mama?" Maggie says, showing just enough of her thin body enveloped in pink skirt and red blouse for me to know she's there, almost hidden by the door. "Come out into the yard," I say. Have you ever seen a lame animal, perhaps a dog, run over by some careless person? That is the way my Maggie walks. She has been like this, chin on the chest, eyes on the ground, feet in shuffle, ever since the fire that burned the other house to the ground. Just like Alice Walker's own personal experience, many times in her stories, there will be a character who has some kind of physical impairment or scarring or something like that. And in her case, it was her eye and the scar tissue in her eye. In Maggie's case, in this story, it is her physical scarring from their original house burning down. And you get this introduction to Maggie in this short little section. I used to think she hated Maggie too, but that was before we raised the money, the church and me, to send her to Augusta to school. And so you get the way the story, even right here, begins to oppose Dee and Maggie, because Maggie always wanted to stay home, to be a part of their tradition, to stay on the family farm, to stay in this rural environment. Dee could not wait to get away, to go away to school in Atlanta. She was determined to stare down any disaster in her efforts. Dee wanted nice things, a yellow organdy dress. Let's see if we can scroll down to that part. A yellow organdy dress to wear to her graduation from high school, black pumps to match a green suit she'd made from an old suit somebody gave her. At 16, she had a style of her own and knew what style was. And then the mom tells you right here, I never had an education myself. One of the differences between Maggie and Dee in this story is you get told, and this is on page, right in the middle of page 917, Maggie has an incredible memory. Maggie's brain is like an elephant. She can retain facts. She knows all this family history and family memory. It's not that Maggie is slow or not smart. She just has a different kind of intelligence than the formal education, the hyperliteracy that Dee has. And then you have this interruption to all the moms sort of thinking and pondering, where when she comes, I will meet, but there they are. Maggie attempts to make a dash for the house in her shuffling way, but I stay her with my hand. Come back here, I say. She stops and tries to dig a well in the sand with her toe. Hard to see them clearly through the strong sun, but even the first glimpse of leg out of the car tells me it's Dee. Her feet were always neat looking, as if God himself had shaped them. From the other side of the car comes a short, stocky man, hairs all over his head, a foot long. Again, the afro, traditionally associated with 1970s Black Power, Black Arts Movement. Hairs all over his head, a foot long, hanging from his chin like a kinky mule tail. I hear Maggie suck in her breath. Dee next, a dress down to the ground, the sort of traditional dashiki-looking female African dress. In this hot weather, a dress so loud it hurts my eyes. There are yellows and oranges, enough to throw back the light of the sun. I feel my whole face warming from the heat waves it throws out. Earrings gold too, hanging down to her shoulder, bracelets dangling and making noises when she moves her arms up to shake the folds of her dress out of her armpits. And just like the guy that she has brought home, Dee has long hair too. As her sister's hair stands straight up like the wool on a sheep. It is as black as night, and around the edges are two long pigtails. Again, this sort of all the trappings of this 1970 Black Power movement, Afro, dashiki style dress, all this embrace of culture and heritage. And you can see that transition when she talks about how she has changed her name. This is one of the central things that people talk about when they talk about this story, is that she has changed her name, and you get that conversation about it on page 916. Let's see if we can scroll down to it. No, Mama, she says, not Dee, Wangaro Liwanika Kamanjo. What happened to Dee, I wanted to know. She's dead. I couldn't bear it any longer, being named after the people who oppress me. You know as well as me you was named after your Aunt Dicey, I say. Dicey is my sister. She named Dee. We called her Big D after Dee was born. But who was she named after, asked Wangaro. I guess after Grandma Dee. And who was she named after? Her mother, I said, and I saw Wangaro was getting tired. That's about as far back as I can trace it, I said, though in fact I probably could have carried it back beyond the Civil War through the branches. Well, said Assalamu alaikum, there you are. And what they are really debating or disputing or tracing, if you want to use the mom's word in this, is what Dee is very clearly talking about is this social and cultural history about being oppressed and the history of African Americans, especially in the Deep South. Her mom and Maggie, by connection, are very clearly talking about personal history and family memory and those kinds of things. The name is important to them because for them it's part of this personal line that goes all the way back through the Civil War and this personal family connection to surviving all these things that their family has gone through and that they've been here for over 100 years, pre-Civil War. So they're both having a conversation about history and legacy. Dee's side of it is just this much more global social cultural history, while her mom's and later Maggie's connection to the quilts is this much more personal and family and local connection. And one of the things that happens in this story is Alice Walker validates both of those perspectives. There is also, it is worth pointing out right down below that, in this sort of social cultural perspective, where the mom has this comment about, it's right at the bottom of page 916, it's right here. Assalamu alaikum had a name twice as long and 3 times as hard. After I tripped over it 2 or 3 times, he told me just to call him Hakeem, a barber. I wanted to ask him, was he a barber? But I didn't really think he was, so I didn't ask. You must belong to those beef cattle people down the road. They say Assalamu alaikum when they meet too, but they didn't shake hands. Always too busy feeding the cattle, fixing the fences. This is this sort of subtle allusion to the Nation of Islam and to the split that was happening in the Nation of Islam after the assassination of Malcolm X, this sort of Sunni Muslim versus Nation of Islam, and the tension and conflict in the Nation of Islam movement in this 1970s Black Power time period. It's hard to pick up on that if you don't know the social and cultural history, and it's not really important in the story. It's just another way that Alice Walker is emphasizing Dee's sort of embrace of this larger global culture versus the local family culture of Maggie and the mom in this story. And he says, I accept some of their doctrines, but farming and raising cattle is not my style. Again, I accept some of their doctrines is that sort of split in the Nation of Islam at that time period. They sit down to eat. We sat down to eat right away. He said he didn't eat collards and pork was unclean. Wangaro, though, went on through the chitlins and cornbread, the greens and everything else, more traditional African-American, especially Southern food. She talked a blue streak over the sweet potatoes, jams, traditional food of the American South and the Caribbean. And then you get into the real heart and the real conflict of the story. I never knew how lovely these benches are. You can feel the rump prints, she said, running her hands underneath her and along the bench. Then she gave a sigh. Her hand closed over Grandma Dee's butter dish. That's it. I knew there was something I wanted to ask you if I could have. She jumped up from the table, went over to the corner where the churn stood, the milk in it clabber by now. She looked at the churn and looked at it. This churn top is what I need. Didn't Uncle Buddy whittle it out of a tree you all used to have? Yes, I said, and I want the dasher too. Uncle Buddy whittled that too? Asked the barber. Dee looked up at me. Aunt Dee's first husband whittled the dash, said Maggie, so low you almost couldn't hear it. His name was Henry, but they called him Stash. This is where you get the Maggie's brain is like an elephant. Maggie knows all of this local history, this family history, this sort of family heritage in a way that Dee never will and has to ask about. She doesn't know who made this or anything like that. But she wants these because they represent this very particular kind of heritage that she has decided to embrace now. After dinner, and this is where you go from the butter churn, and if you don't know what Dee has gotten, let's look that up. So we can show, so you'll have an idea of what she wanted. This is the kind of traditional butter churn. This is this dasher right here is the top part, the handle and the top, and that is what Dee has wanted and gotten to use as like a decoration in her house. What you would do is put milk in this little barrel and then use that handle to churn it until you made butter. Back in the day, when people used to churn butter by hand. But then the story turns from her claiming the butter churn to, after dinner, Dee went to the trunk at the foot of my bed and started rifling through it. Maggie hung back in the kitchen. Out came Wangaro with 2 quilts. They had been pieced by Grandma Dee and then Big D. The names of her ancestors that she has decided she doesn't want anymore, but she wants the quilts that they made. And me had hugged them on the quilt frames on the front porch and quilted them. One was in the Lone Star pattern, the other was Walk Around the Mountain. Both of them were scraps of dresses Grandma Dee had worn 50 and more years ago. Again, she doesn't want this person's name anymore, but she wants the quilts. Bits and pieces of Grandma Jadal's paisley shirts, and one teeny faded blue piece about the size of a penny matchbox that was from Great-Grandpa Ezra's uniform that he wore in the Civil War. Again, the mom could trace their family history all the way back to the Civil War, but Dee is not interested in that particular family history, even though she's interested in the artifacts of her family from that time. Mama, Wangaro said, sweet as a bird, can I have these old quilts? I heard something fall in the kitchen, and a minute later the kitchen door slammed. This Maggie in the kitchen, and she's upset because the quilts have been promised to her. Why don't you take 1 or 2 of the others, I asked. These old things are just done by me and Big D from some tops your grandma pieced before she died. No, said Wangaro, I don't want those. They are stitched around the borders by machine. That'll make them last better, I said. That's not the point. These are all pieces of dresses Grandma used to wear. She did all this stitching by hand. And you have that, the reason she wants them is that they were made by these people who she is named after. She doesn't want the name anymore. She just wants the artifacts as this sort of show or performance of her personal history. The truth is, let's scroll down here. The truth is, I said, I promised to give them quilts to Maggie for when she marries John Thomas. That's the real heart of this matter. It's not that Dee's right. It's not that Maggie's right. Dee wants to take them home and preserve them. These artifacts that are, 150 years old, she wants to preserve them almost like their museum piece. Maggie would take them and use them when she got married, but Maggie also has the skills to make more of them. And so in that way, she is practically carrying on this tradition in a way that Dee never could. And so they are both preserving their heritage just in very different ways. The reason that Maggie deserves the quilts is because they were already promised to her. The mom, and Dee's response to that, though, is her real fault, her real flaw. I promised to give them quilts to Maggie. She gasped like a bee had stung her. Maggie can't appreciate these quilts. She'd probably be backward enough to put them to everyday use, where the story gets its title. I reckon she would. God knows I've been saving them for long enough and nobody using them. I hope she will. I didn't want to bring up how I'd offered Dee a quilt when she went away to college. Then she had told me they were old-fashioned, out of style. But they're priceless, she was saying now furiously, for she has a temper. Maggie would put them on the bed and in 5 years they'd be rags. She can always make some more, I said. Maggie knows how to quilt. Dee looked at me with hatred. You just will not understand. The point is these quilts. The one person, though, who could carry on this tradition and who does understand in this very practical, personal way is Maggie. You could hang these up like Dee is wanting to, but the way to carry on this tradition in a living, practical way is the way Maggie could carry it on, which is she doesn't just want the artifacts of the family. She has the skills that her family members passed down to her. Well, I said, what would you do with them? Hang them, she said, as if that was the only thing you could do with quilts. Maggie by now is standing in the door. I could almost hear the sound her feet made as they scraped over each other. And Maggie, as she has always done in her life, just defers. She can have them. She defers to Dee. She can have them, Mama. Like somebody used to never winning anything or having anything reserved for her. I can remember Grandma Dee without the quilts. I looked at her hard. She'd filled her bottom lip with checkerberry snuff and gave her face a kind of dopey hangdog look. And then you get the epiphany in this story. When I looked at her like that, something hit me on the top of the head and ran down to the soles of my feet. Just like when I'm in church and the Spirit of God touches me and I get happy and shout. Again, when there's an epiphany in this story, Alice Walker connects it very specifically to the traditional religious connotations, religious meanings of it. I did something I'd never done before. Hugged Maggie to me, dragged her on into the room, snatched the quilts out of Miss Wangerow's hands and dumped them into Maggie's lap. Maggie just sat there on my bed with her mouth open. Take one or two of the others, I said to Dee. But she turned without a word and went out to Akima Barber. You just don't understand, she said as Maggie and I came out to the car. Dee gets mad. She doesn't get her way. She's used to getting her way. And so when she doesn't get the quilts and doesn't get her way, and that's at the bottom, that we're at the bottom of 918, top of 919. What don't I understand? I wanted to know. Your heritage, she said. And this is the real contrast in this story, because in a sort of global sense, Dee does understand their heritage, and she's embraced all of this African culture unfiltered through the African American experience. But as the quilts prove, their family and local experience for at least the past 150 years is this much more local culture of quilting and raking the yard and eating these particular kinds of local Southern food and stuff like that. And so they do understand it. They don't need to hang up these quilts. They live this culture every day. Maggie and the mother do. And Maggie has embraced it to the point that she could make more quilts. She could do the thing to make the quilts like her grandmother taught her in a way that Dee can never act out in a practical way. She can put the butter churn on her table. She can hang the quilts like they're in, like her house is a museum to preserve these things. But they have no practical everyday use, like in the title of the story. It's the mom and Maggie who are carrying things on who have embraced their heritage in that practical way. And you see that. And then she turns to Maggie, kissed her, and said, you ought to try to make something of yourself too, Maggie. It's really a new day for us, but from the way you and Mama still live, you'd never know it. And so Dee is never going to see that sort of practical, everyday living out of your heritage and that sort of cultural memory instead of cultural history, the things that have been passed down to you and that Maggie has in her memory. Maggie smiled, maybe at the sunglasses, but a real smile, not scared. And after we watched the car dust settle, I asked Maggie to bring me a dip of snuff. And then the two of us sat there just enjoying until it was time to go in the house and go to bed. And so there is this resolution after the mom has the epiphany. To go back to the epiphany right here, when I looked at her like that, something hit me in the top of the head. What the mom realizes is not that Maggie's right or that Dee's wrong or anything like that. She realizes that she had promised the quilts to Maggie, and just because Dee is used to getting her way and getting everything she demands, that is not a reason for her to override the promise she made to Maggie. And so what she does when she takes the quilts and gives them to Maggie is just keep her promise and not let Dee run over everybody just because of she is louder and in your face. And is used to getting her way. She finally tells Dee no in a way that she's just not used to hearing, and tells Maggie yes in a way that she's not used to hearing and experiencing. This is the part of the reason this story is so famous is because it really reflects a lot of the things that Alice Walker talks about. This sort of growing up in rural, especially African American Southern culture. Often the characters in her stories have this combination of growing up rural, growing up sort of close to the earth, and then being exposed to urban environments, whether it's Atlanta or New York City or going off to college, and the sort of contrast between those two worlds. And people struggling with those contrasts, like the two sisters do in this story, this sort of acting out and living out this contrast. that is, this is a pretty short story, and that's really all there is to say about it. You can come back. There's a relatively famous essay about this story called Counterpointed Characterizations by a guy named Charles Baxter that has helped make this story even more famous, because what Charles Baxter argues in that essay is that this is a story that doesn't have any real conflict. It's a story that the conflict in this story is not traditional conflict. It is the tension between the way these two sisters act and why they want what they want and how they act out getting what they want. And that goes back to the response topic, which is it asks you how are they set up to oppose each other? How is the tension, where does the tension come from, and how is it made in this story? How are they different, and what are all the ways they are different and oppose each other? The ways that they interact with their heritage, the way that one is used to getting their way, the way the other one is used to always hearing no and not getting her way. Think about, if you want to write this response, think about all the ways that they are set up to oppose each other. If you've got questions about that or need help with this paper, be in touch with me via email or whatever way you're most comfortable with, and I'll be happy to help you. Otherwise, thank you for your time. And this has been the Alice Walker section of our American Literature 2 class. I'll see you guys next time. Thank you for your time.